A warm welcome to all panelists, viewers, and eavesdroppers globally to this panel on alternate economic systems. I'm Rajani Kanth, and I'll be moderating this session. A part purpose in organizing this panel was to suggest that there exist alternatives, some known and some possibly waiting to be discovered as regards economic systems. So we may need to do some thinking and perhaps more importantly, rethinking. Our distinguished panelists today are Radhika Desai, Steve Keen, and Poelina and Genevieve Vaughan. There's also a very slight chance that Jeff Sachs might be able to appear towards the end of this session, if his schedule permits. The modus operandi is as follows. I will ask each panelist one query each in two separate rounds of questioning. In the first round, I asked them to explain the workings of the economic system they are to speak on. I have asked Radhika to speak on socialism, Steve on capitalism, Genevieve on unilateral gifting, and Anne on the economics of well-being. They'll have 10 minutes each. The order of appearance is as follows: Steve, Radhika, Anne, and then Genevieve. In the second round, I'll be asking them to expound further the merits of the system as they see it. This time, they'll have 5 minutes each. Diane Weidenkopf, our eminence Greece and IT host for this session, will firmly monitor these timings for all of us. If you like Diane, you can say hello to everyone, or it's up to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm looking forward to it.
Lovely. So we will then thereafter move to a quick cross conversation. Regrettably, severe time constraints obviate the possibility of any viewer Q&A. By way of brief intro now, provision of the material prereqs of human existence lies in the general domain of what we call economics in the modern world. These can be produced and allocated in numerous ways. In modern times, solidified first in the European world, and since the 18th century, much of the world has been under the sway of what we understand as capitalism. Until recently, however, a large swath of human society has also lived under what was termed socialism. But long prior to both, humanity has lived under multiple variants of what I will simply call generically a tribal economy. Today, our panel will explain these disparate systems to indicate their modes of functioning and perhaps their raison d'etre. Possibly this discussion might help clarify matters as to the nature of the inherent differences between these systems, and who knows, maybe give us some new ideas as well. Of course, for the most part, such systems historically were not voted in by any form of majority consent. Some spontaneously evolved, some were imposed by force. So the idea of choosing between systems as options on a menu may be a very limiting notion. Rarely do we elect in modernist society a specific form of an economic system. Perhaps you might question why we don't. It is governing elites generally that make such choices when history affords them the option, and the rest of society goes along, consciously or unconsciously, agreeably or unhappily. Today, we might also speculate, and I use that term advisedly, whether there is some ideal economy that meets our needs, much as an ideal society, or are such notions mere chimera, simply utopian? At any rate, with that as a very hurried prologue, let's get started. Let me then first call upon Steve Keen to lead us into this discussion.
Well, thank you, Rajani. As my task has been to describe what capitalism is, and of course, that's rather like describing an elephant. It depends upon whether you grab the leg, the trunk, the body, etc., etc. And I think with our attempts to even think about the current system, let alone devise an alternative, has been polluted by the fact that we all have partial views of the system coming from various forms of ideology. And I've been trying for my whole academic career to try to get a set of grounded concepts which simply cannot be disagreed with, to say, well, that what is actually the nature of capitalism. So I'm not going to talk about the labor theory of value for Marxists. I'm not going to talk about the utility theory of value for neoclassicals. I'm going to look at what the system actually functions as, and it's the starting point is that capitalism is a monetary system of production. Money plays a vital role in a capitalist economy, and mainstream economics, which we call neoclassical economics, has completely ignored the money side. They haven't said that money doesn't matter, but they say that money only affects the inflation rate. It doesn't affect what they call the real level of output. Now, when you take a look at that using the absolutely essential tool for analysing financial flows, which is double entry bookkeeping, their model simply doesn't make sense. It's a mythical model. And what I want to show very quickly is why that mythical model is why we're having financial crises right now, because people think the government is borrowing from the public. So I've built a software package I call Ravel, which enables me to model concepts like that. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. If this is a bit confusing, I apologize, but go to my Patreon or Substack site and you'll see things done rather more slowly there. So if you can see my screen at the moment, it should be coming up shortly. That is a Ravel model. And again, I don't have time to explain the overall logic there, but I want to focus on just one part of it, and that's show what banks are supposed to do according to economic textbooks. And that's now this screen, which is just taking out the banking section of that model. And that basically, the neoclassicals teach their poor students, their victims, that banks are what they call pure intermediaries. Banks don't actually lend money. They operate as an introduction service, introducing savers to borrowers. And the savers are households, the borrowers are firms, and also the government. And what you get out of that, and again, this is going to be too fast for great detail, but if you simulate it, what you find is the government borrowing money causes a runaway level in government debt. There's a percentage of GDP, it becomes absolutely unsustainable. It's growing very slowly there, but if I let that run for long enough, you'll see a level of debt reaching 200, 300, 400% of GDP. Interest payments ultimately become equal to GDP itself. It's obviously an unsustainable system. And that's the sort of thing that I think Elon Musk has in his brain, though he's not aware of it. It's equally the UK Treasurer, Rachel Reeves, the same sort of thing. Now, it takes me roughly a minute to go from that structure, which pretends that households are the lenders and banks are not, to the real world in which banks are the lenders. And that's the result of making that change. I make no other changes to the equations in the model. If I simulate the same thing, this time with the 5% of GDP deficit, so the government is spending 5% of GDP more than it gets back in taxes, there is no crisis because that process actually creates money. And that creation of money means that the rate of growth of the debt stabilizes down to the rate of growth of GDP itself. You can see the debt ratio there is curving down towards a horizontal asymptote, whereas previously it was going vertical. Now, that is one of the many myths that we have that obstructs how people think and reason about capitalism. Another side, and I'll do this rather more quickly, it's rather more mathematical. This is taking a set of purely, absolutely true by definition statements. The wages share of GDP, which is wages divided by GDP, the employment rate, which is employment divided by population, the private debt ratio, which is private debt divided by GDP. Simply putting those together and making the simplest possible assumptions to link the system state. So workers' wage capacity to get wage demands depends upon the employment rate. Capitalists willing to invest depends upon the profit rate. If you simulate that model, what you get is what's called a strange attractor in the system, which results ultimately in a debt deflation. Too much private debt is taken on. Private debt is something you can't repay. That ultimately leads to the point where the system collapses into zero employment, zero wage share, and an infinite private debt ratio. Now, that is what government spending actually counteracts. It doesn't let that happen. But because we have all these myths created by neoclassical economists at one extreme and Labour theory of value Marxists at the other, and this actually originates from a non-Labour theory of value element of Marxist thought back in the 1860s. What we've ended up with is a system where we're destabilizing an unstable system by trying to reduce government spending and having more and more crises and so on. So unless we understand that capitalism is a monetary system of production, and we understand government's role in that is by counter-cyclical spending to stop it falling into a debt deflation. We have bizarre notions about how to make capitalism better. And I think that's a major reason why we are on the cusp of a whole series of catastrophes, which I largely relate to climate change now. But that poisons our brains. We have to get a clear picture of how the system we live in works before we can talk about reforming.
I was just saying, are you done? Oh, you obviously are. Okay.
Okay, so and you want me to talk about socialism, and that's what I'll do. So I thought I would begin by kind of going back to first principles. Why do we need socialism? Because in a certain sense, what Steve is saying is that capitalism can be improved, its performance can be improved and made a more desirable form of society than we have at the moment. And no doubt there were times when capitalism was on much better behavior, and has seen therefore better times. Having said that, I think the political possibilities of that kind of transformation that Steve is talking about are basically diminishing to a vanishing point. So from my point of view, if we went to go back, we talk about socialism, let's start by going back to first principles. Firstly, socialism is not a form of economy. The idea that the economy is separate from society is a fiction. It's a fiction which is not even true in capitalism, although in capitalism, it is a necessary fiction. In reality, society, politics, economics, etc., all form a historical whole. So we are not talking about an economic system, but a form of society. And I would be sufficiently Marxist to say that until our capacity to produce becomes so great as to release us from spending most of our waking hours making a living, release most of humanity from that, the form of society will be determined by the manner in which we choose to produce and reproduce our livelihoods. Also, secondly, another first point I want to make is that it's not really a question of what individuals such as you or I prefer, but what society and the world ends up fighting for, because we cannot create the society we want from a clean slate. We have to start from here to get there, wherever there is. But here, we know what here is. Steve has been, it's kind of a bit of the opposite of what Steve was saying, in the sense that he was implicitly criticizing the kind of society in which we live. So with these provisos, I would say that my preferred form of society would be one that sets the three key relationships that we have right. Our relationship with nature, our relationship with society, namely each other, and our relationship to ourselves. And in my humble opinion, it can only be a form of socialism, with our relationship with nature assuming the eco-socialist bit, and a relationship to society also assuming that our relationships are relationships of thriving, not exploitation, and do not involve things like patriarchy, misogyny, racism, etc., etc. Okay, so and so to me, that society, this kind of society, will be capable of developing to a historically unprecedented extent what Marx and Engels referred to when they were talking about the productive forces that slumber in the lap of social labor. There is a very widespread belief that capitalism is the only system capable of doing that. But I think that we are already living in times when the capitalist system is stymieing the further development of human productive capacities, human social productive capacities. And I think that this should be allowed to, socialism will allow that to allow that to advance further by freeing up human creativity, by freeing up our capacity to cooperate with one another rather than exploit and conflict with one another. It must also be egalitarian in the sense of both within a society, among people, within a people, and between peoples, and therefore not based on the ability of some to exploit others, whether the others are individuals or entire societies. And of course, it must permit the freest and fullest development of art and culture. Now, this does not necessarily involve creating a command economy, although with the development of information technology, we are much closer today than we were even, say, 3 decades ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, to having the capacity to plan fairly comprehensively and fairly minutely what needs to be produced with sufficient feedback loops in order to enable us to not have the problems that Soviet planning had. And in fact, it's not a surprise that it was the Soviets who made some of the first advances in cybernetic technology, precisely because for them, having better information technology was a real world problem of planning. So that's another point that I would make. So it doesn't have to be about creating a command economy, although creating a command economy is much easier today than it was before. It can allow a significant level of private enterprise. But of course, this private enterprise can only exist within an overall framework of a planned economy. Socialism, therefore, is not really about markets versus the state, but really about who controls the state, and is it big capital that controls the state or state that controls capital? And I think once we have the latter form, we are already well advanced on the road to some kind of socialism. Whether or not we arrive at the end to a point at which there is no capital, there is no state, etc., we would have to see, but certainly we would be on the way there. Yeah. And there are some other advantages to this sort of society. I would say that one advantage is that it would really address real wants rather than simulated wants. We are always told when we take Economics 101 that the market, the free market, supplies us with what we need. No, that's not what markets do, or at least, well, first of all, markets aren't actors, markets are arenas. In these arenas, actors, namely capitalist firms, small or large, supply you with what they can supply, and they try to persuade you to want what they have to supply. And in this process, they create a lot of simulative needs, a lot of products that are actually harmful to us rather than helpful to us, that harm our physical as well as increasingly our mental health, and we would be free of that. It's also society. Steve spoke about money. I would say that, I wouldn't say that capitalism is necessarily, that money is unique to capitalism. There have been money systems in practically every ancient society because some form of accounting is always necessary in every society. So I would say that while, in fact, money predates capitalism by centuries, perhaps even millennia. So in that sense, but nevertheless, in a socialist society, money would be a tool of planning. Money would be a way of reckoning exactly where resources are being deployed, with what results, what products are being produced, consumed, etc., etc. And that's what the money system would be devoted to. So all in all, I would say that socialism is, for centuries, people have thought about socialism. People, whenever you ask people about the kind of society they want to see, they invariably talk about all the things that we take to be socialist, involving greater equality, but also greater freedom. Capitalism claims to be about freedom, but is in reality only about freedom of some. It's about the freedom of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to take trips to space at obscene prices, while, of course, their own compatriots, let alone people in the rest of the world, are living below poverty lines, are undernourished even, let alone having other problems, including debt and so on. So these are some of the dimensions of socialism that I would emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Now I'll call upon Anne, and she's going to speak about economic well-being and, I suppose, social well-being as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm not an economist, so I'm coming from a different language and a different frame. So my name is Anne Poelina. I'm from the Kimberley in Western Australia, in Australia. It's a really interesting conversation because we are the oldest culture in the world, and for our people to have lived for so long with the focus of peace, harmony and balance, and now being in a situation where we've been confronted with colonialism and this capital concept of money, 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 where the world we inherited was about a duty of care and a moral obligation, because we see ourselves as coming from a world of we and not me. So the individualism is not really a frame that we aspire to. So it's about the collective well-being of everyone and everything around us. So it's a really interesting conversation we're having because, as I said, our people lived and traded and had all of the things that, you were just, the previous speaker was talking about: relationship, respect, reciprocity, and with rights comes responsibility. So it was indeed about the greater good of all of us, including how we see our non-human kin, the ability to reach your full potential as a human being. So now we're confronted with a new system through colonialism, which is very much about the me and not the we, and looking at, how we achieve the things that we look at. So because I'm in Australia, which is, a lucky country and very, very wealthy, my people still live in fourth world conditions, and we still live with colonialism. There is no post-colonialism. So what we continue to have is invasive, unjust development where it's top-down centralised power that is toxic and telling us how we're going to consume everything we know. I mean, there's a new conversation globally happening at the moment around the nature repair market, and it seems a shame that we've had to destroy biodiversity to create a market. So all of these things are fairly new for us in terms of how do we shift from poverty to wealth creation when we're living in a colonial system very much focused on capitalism and grow, which is now with the confrontation of climate change, it can't be business as usual. It cannot. And so all of the systems that we heavily rely on as Indigenous people is from nature. Our food, our medicine, our therapeutic ability to ignite our spirit and connect with nature and see that as kin. So what we have is a total clash of values, and who is counting those values and how they are actually accounted for. So it's a really interesting conversation in terms of one of the things that I'm doing with our people is trying to look at, is it business as usual? And so part of that conversation is, what is the situational analysis? Because we always governed on scale. We always governed on a bioregional perspective that looked at, in a way, cumulative impacts. If you do something up on the river, it's going to impact on me down the river. If you're going to clear vast areas of land, the savanna system, what is that? I've just produced a film, and one of the things that's in that film is we're looking at water justice and climate justice because they go hand in hand. But one of the stories that one of the scientists talks about is he was confronted with a conversation where they were looking to divert water, and this traditional owner said to the scientists, always be careful and understand that you know what that water was doing before you shifted it. So water is the new gold. As it gets more and more rare around the world, it becomes scarcity and the price goes up. So this is what we're saying, is that as Indigenous people, we look at this and we go, okay, how do all of those things that we care about that makes us human and gives us that opportunity to reach our full potential, how do we bring that in? So one of the things that we have decided to do with the work I do is have a look at the situational analysis. What is the business as usual model? How is it going to impact on human beings and the environment and all of those things that we care about and value and hold close to us? How is that going to happen? So part of that is understanding what is the intention of government? What is the intention of those who hold power in terms of changing our quality of life and the system that we have guarded as traditional owners and care for as diligent stewards? How is this going to change the world that we have inherited and we continue to care for? So it's really important to understand unjust development on unjust terms and look at how do we as Indigenous people, particularly in Australia, start to look at what could be the opportunities before we destroy them. This place that I live is possibly one of the last rivers in the world that remains beautiful and flowing and doing all these amazing things. What happens when you change, in a way, a language that I've heard is, how do you rebuild a river? What is the cost of that? What does that cost to us socially, culturally, human, and spiritual? How do those values come into a systems thinking which is all about more and more production and more business as usual? So one of the things that we've started to look at is, how do we build and change the frame of economy, caring for our home, caring for the environment in which we live, which gives us everything? So many people may not know, but in Australia we live in fourth world conditions where we don't even have water fit for human consumption. And all we see is the agenda of growth, growth, growth. And we kind of figure that where we are as a species, a human species in terms of humanity, is that we need to have a pause and reflect on the world that we want our young people to inherit. And so for us, it's really looking at what are those development projects that would give us a purpose and a freedom for development that could change our whole world. So we're working with a whole range of people. One, to understand what are the propositions for unjust development on unjust terms. How can we have an alternative narrative that brings the people with us? Can we develop business that is great for all of us, or do we just continue to service the predatory elite? So from this perspective, one of the things is first understanding what is the intention of government? What do they want to do that is going to change our world, our life views? How do we look at these systems? And one of the things where I live is that water is free. There is no water market, there's no water trading. So right now we're in a situation where our government is giving a public commodity, which is water, to the richest people in the world to profit, and that is supposed to be equity. So for us, it's looking at the world from an Indigenous perspective, realizing that we're living in a system. But one of the things that we're saying is that let's go back to basics. If we are going to survive as a human species, what are those core values that have meaning and depth and bring us into that conversation? So we're looking at, some of the different economic models around the world where we don't need to destroy the environment. Is there an alternative narrative that says that we can do these things and we can do it so that we reach our full potential? So one of the things we're very much focused on is those things that kept us together as a society, as human beings, which is around social capital, human capital, cultural capital, and we're living in a capitalist system, so we need some of that real money. So this is what we're doing. We're looking at where are those models, such as what Nelson Mandela developed, which was global geoparks. Why can't we bring people to country to experience this? That this is a beautifully biodiverse place with an amazing river, which is diverse, which we have just been noted as the first in the world for developing a living water museum. How does all this diversity, the biodiversity, the cultural diversity, how does that all come into play so that we can reach our full potential as human beings and experience the world under our due inheritance to share with fellow Australians and global citizens? So we're looking at these situations of business as usual, what are the new economies, and we are calling it the economics of well-being, because we believe that without all of these other sorts of values that we are sustaining, we can never be fully human. So for us, it's about a word that we are, in a way, coming up with, which is communityism. How do we as a community function together? How do we have a dream to reach our full potential, to ensure young people reach their full potential? So it's really dreaming new ways. Yeah, it is dreaming new ways that we can enjoy where we're living, not be destroyed by invasive, unjust development, and share this economics of well-being with people who want to come and walk on their country, learn and listen from Indigenous wisdom, polycentric governance, bottom-up stuff, away from the toxic centralised power. But how can we dream a new dream so that our young people, both Indigenous and not, can reach their full potential, but still have access to these amazing places so that they can experience what it is to be human? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now I'll ask Genevieve to talk to us about unilateral gift giving.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I'm so happy to be here with you, all of you. We are at a disastrous point in human history. Something is terribly wrong. And this is my attempt at a diagnosis. I believe that repeated giving and receiving and passing it on form the original template for human life. I come to this from semiotics rather than directly from economics. And I have written about communication and language as giving and receiving, satisfying one another's communicative and cognitive needs. The same kind of process holds for satisfying one another's physical life needs. Marcel Mauss described the gift economy as creating human relations in 3 steps: giving, receiving, and giving back. He did not realize that the first two steps already create a human relation, and that this happens in every viable life in infancy and early childhood, creating an important early model of unilateral giving and receiving. In fact, some researchers consider the care given to children by adults as the turning point in human evolution, as shown in the book Costly and Cute, Helpless Infants and Human Evolution, edited by Wenda Trevathan and Karen Rosenberg. The care elicited by the early hominid child, not only from the mother, but from the grandmother and other members of the family and group, had a decisive part in human socialization and community formation. The care of young children has to be unilateral because the children cannot survive on their own. In fact, they are born with underdeveloped brains because their heads have to fit through the birth canal that is made narrow by the necessity of upright posture for bipedalism. Thus, the necessity of unilateral care by adults and older children. The model of unilateral care giving has therefore been present since primordial times, much older than quid pro quo, market exchange, and money. And it is still present in early childhood and maternal care today. In fact, it is so prevalent that we should actually call ourselves Homo donans instead of Homo sapiens, because we are really a giving and receiving being, but we don't know that we are. I consider the so-called domestic sphere of the capitalist economy as the modern day continuation of our original species being as Homo donans, while the market sphere is a mechanism for taking, amassing, and redistributing gifts, thereby creating a predatory social mutation, Homo economicus, a species that uses the capitalist market to direct the gifts of the many towards an ever more powerful few. Here too, the species does not know what it is doing, and so it is not even Homo sapiens, nor especially Homo sapiens sapiens, because it does not know that it does not know. And this seems to give it license to experiment with everything. Unilateral gifts are not seen as such, and this is a circumstance that protects the market from recognizing its dependence upon them. Instead, they are called housework, unwaged work, surplus labor, or in Jason Moore's term in his book, The Rise and Fall of Cheap Nature, they are the four cheaps: cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. Refocusing our lens, we can see that they are cheap because a large portion of them is free and a gift to the receiver. Exploitation itself is leveraging free gifts from others by force or deception, backed up by social structures such as private property, the market, and the law. Moore rejects the idea that the destructive era we are living in should be called the Anthropocene, and instead proposes the Capitalocene. I agree with this because I do not think the human being as Homo donans is responsible for this disaster. Rather, it is the economically distorted species of Homo economicus, altered by capitalism towards solipsistic egotism, power, and the predation of gifts. Moreover, in the USA, these considerations also hold for corporations that have the same rights as individuals and have been able, through funding the denial of climate change, to continue and even expand their destructive extractive practices to the detriment of all. In fact, the capitalist economy is a gift extracting mechanism that survives and thrives by creating ever new ways to discover, elicit, and capture gifts of profit. These include progress in manufacturing, agriculture, medicine, armaments, and the academic institutions that supply the necessary research and validation to foster their elaboration, to improve upon them, and to frame and promote the improvements as gifts to humanity. Cute and costly infants continue to promote their own survival by eliciting unilateral gifts of nurture and care in the world today, just as they did in prehistory, making us evolve into Homo donans, communitary beings, a species perfectly adapted to living on Mother Earth, receiving, caring for, and sharing her gifts. Most unfortunately, capitalism and the drive for accumulation and patriarchal power have made some parts of our species parasitic on others and on the earth without knowing it themselves. They are not sapiens, and they don't know that they don't know. But neither do the hosts usually know that they are giving unilaterally to them through a gift-taking mechanism. We have come to a terrible three-pronged turning point. On the one hand, we have genocide caused by power and land-hungry national leaders in sync with similar leaders in other nations who gift them with genocidal armaments. On the other, we have the destruction of a major city caused by climate gone berserk from the poisonous pollution poured into it. Pictures of Gaza and LA look alike. They are two views of the destruction caused by the same disease. Rubble and scorched earth in both cases. And over it all hangs the nuclear threat, held back by who knows what thin threads of reason belonging to career war makers. Still, it is not our species, Homo donans, that has done this, but Homo economicus. We have to return quickly to the unilateral gift economy that we learned as children from our nurturers. Unilateral gifting seems impossible for most people, even godlike. But it is commonplace, as I have been saying, for motherers of small children who require it for their survival. Freeing unilateral gifting from the gift-plundering capitalism can allow the validation of the satisfaction of needs beyond exchange. There are many experiments in gifting: free stores, buy-nothing groups, online sharing networks, eco-villages, transition towns. Solidarity and activist organizations and individuals devote their lives to solving social problems by creating the gift of social change. There are many hybrids. Even political parties are motivated by some people trying to make things better. And they try to do this by eliciting the gifts of donations.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. Maybe you get the general gist, but
you have 1 minute, Genevieve.
Well, I don't have the time to say what I need to say.
You do have 1 minute, so you can continue.
Okay. Well, I believe that by reinstating a gift economy and the values of the gift economy, we can begin to transition away from this deadly economy that we are in towards some kind of way of living that is in harmony with the earth.
Well, thank you, Genevieve. I'm sorry that you weren't able to conclude your talk. That concludes the first round of questioning, and now we'll move to the second round. And I'll again begin with Steve, and this time I'm going to ask him what he thinks objectively might be the merits of the system he spoke about, i.e. capitalism. And so I hope you can engage with that, Steve.
The main merits, you have to compare capitalism to all the various social systems that have preceded it. And I'd have to say that the main merit of capitalism compared to socialism as it was practiced in the Soviet Union and so on, not China, obviously, because China has been outrageous success on this front, and feudalism before that, is encouraging innovation. That's if you want any defense of capitalism, forget about it being an equilibrium system. That is a complete and absolute delusion, but it's what neoclassical economists have swallowed and pumped out for the last 150 years. The real advantage is that it encourages innovation. Now, the thing is innovation without limit, and that's the problem. But fundamentally, the level of technological luxuries we have these days is entirely due to the fact that it was profitable for people like James Watt to come along and improve the original steam engine to give it a way of separating, condensing from expanding, and dramatically increase the extent to which we exploited free energy in the form of coal, then oil, etc., etc. So the level of even though there's obvious poverty on the planet, including in the wealthiest nations here, when you look at the average standard of living for the advanced nations, you have a level of luxury that we don't realize because we're too close to it happening, but it's relative luxury compared to what applied 150 years ago. For example, most of us in the West have warm showers. That was a luxury for kings and queens just 150 years ago. So there are so many things like that which come out of the innovations that capitalism inspires, combines with the discoveries of science that let us work out mechanisms to exploit energy to transform the goods and the natural environment into commodities. That's a huge advantage. The danger, of course, in that advantage is we keep on doing it without limit. And this comes back to some of Anne's comments about the difference between indigenous cultures, particularly the longest lived on the planet, Australian Aboriginal culture, and modern capitalism. And that is that the indigenous cultures, because they were integrated with the land for such a huge length of time, we see this in the comments of Native Americans as well, is that they saw themselves as custodians of life, not exploiters of life. Now, we need a capitalism that, if capitalism was going to survive, we'd need to have a system which combined the innovation that capitalism aspires with respect for life. We don't have that. I don't think we will get it. And a large part of it, again, comes down to the delusions that infect people's minds from studying neoclassical economics and from being ideologically biased. You want to show that capitalism is the best of all possible social systems if you happen to be a wealthy capitalist. It falls into place that way. But certainly innovation is what it's inspired. And to compare it to socialism on that front, one of the best explanators of why socialism did not achieve the same level of innovation is the work of recently deceased a colleague, János Kornai, the Hungarian economist who tried to understand why did a socialist system not lead to the innovation that capitalism did. And he came down to it being capitalism being demand constrained rather than supply constrained. And by being demand constrained, the way you got customers into your shop or buying your products was to innovate, whereas the socialist system was supply constrained, and therefore you never got innovation being performed properly. So if we look at a future society which is a more socialist foundation, we need to find ways to make sure that innovation still occurs, but it must be within the constraints of the biosphere, which we are currently massively exceeding. And that's why I'll come back to that issue in, I think, our third round where we talk about. We only have a third round, aren't we, Rajani? Yeah.
I said the third round would be my going back to sleep. It's 5 a.m. here. But so I think we'll stick with the second round. Are you done, Steve?
Okay, well, no, well, in that case, I'll finish on the most important point. That
Yes,
is
please.
human civilization, I believe, is going to collapse in the next 1 or 2 decades. And the reason being climate change. And the reason we have not done anything to address it is the appallingly bad work done by mainstream economists who simply wanted to assume that growth could go on indefinitely and therefore made up numbers. They did not use what scientists did. They made up their own stupid numbers on crazy grounds to say that we could, for example, experience 7 degrees of global warming reaching 7 degrees in 2 centuries' time. That would only reduce the annual rate of growth by 0.14%. Now, that's actually the results of a survey of over 2,000 so-called climate change economists done in 2021. They have no idea of what climate change means. We're going to have reality smashing into us very drastically. And in that situation, the difficult thing is going to be hanging on to any form of civilization whatsoever.
Thank you, Steve. And Radhika, you may simply use this as an opportunity to continue on what you were saying previously. And also, I think one point I'd like to make for everybody is that partly this is not for specialists, but for lay people who may not understand many of the technical terms they're using. So as far as possible, to use simpler language to explain whatever it is that you're trying to say. Please carry on, Radhika.
Sure. Okay, so let me just say that I'm afraid, Steve, I'm going to differ with you on a number of points, because in this session, we are supposed to argue about what makes a system we're talking about, in my case, socialism, superior. And naturally, when we're talking about socialism, it's almost inescapable that we must talk about capitalism. And a lot of the dismissal of socialism, which I think has been disastrous for humanity, has arisen because of the myth making around capitalism. And one of the key myths about capitalism, a very Schumpeterian myth, is that it is good at innovation. Cornai's distinction between demand-constrained capitalism and supply-constrained socialism leads you to expect, or insofar as it's supposed to prompt innovation in capitalism, the constraint of demand is based on a completely false premise. It completely overlooks the fact that companies spend much more money innovating the ways in which they can inveigle you into buying the things that you don't need, but they need to sell, than anything else. And I think that's why we've come to the kind of situation that we have. And having said that, it's not, funnily enough, that we should talk about capitalist innovation this week of all weeks, when we have just been reading in the newspapers that China's DeepSeek has just revealed the extent to which Western plans for AI and Western schemes for AI, devised by the biggest Western corporations, are basically, were proposing to invest millions and billions of dollars in a wrong way. So, and the Soviet Union gave previously us the Sputnik moment. So people are saying today we have another Sputnik moment for AI. Back then, we have a Sputnik moment when the Russians put a satellite into space and essentially shamed the Americans into undertaking the stunt of landing a human being on the moon. Go figure. The other thing as well is that, speaking of, piped water and hot water and so on, the comforts and prosperity in which the West lives is also generally attributed to capitalism and its dynamism, its innovation, its what is creative destruction, and all these paradoxical words that are supposed to make us feel overawed and impressed with capitalism. People forget the extent to which the current prosperity of the West is based on imperialism, and the extent to which which is also why the stagnation that the West has been suffering over the last decade and a half, since the 2008 financial crisis in particular, and the return of inflation today is a mark of the fact that the West's imperialist capacities are shrinking. And as a result of that, it is going to face, I agree with you completely about climate change, that we are facing a catastrophe, we are already in it. But in addition to that, there is going to be further social breakdown unless there are coherent movements to talk about a different type of society. There's also the further question of, what is innovation for? Is it to improve human lives or to make profits for somebody? The two paths lead in very different directions. Capitalism has so far created a relatively decent lifestyle for only a small fraction of humanity. Meanwhile, I should emphasize that in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, before communism ended in these societies, I put communism in quotation marks, of course, but whatever they were societies attempting to build socialism. The level of prosperity, material well-being that was reached in these societies was at least comparable to that in the West. And I think that's not something that you can sneeze at. People used to say, those economies were basket cases, but people forget something else. These achievements of the Soviet Union back then, or China today, were achieved against three obstacles that the West never faced. In fact, for the West, they were privileges. Number one, they had to achieve the development that they achieved from a starting point to which they had been pushed back by imperialism. Number two, they had to do it in the face of imperialist resistance, and including wars, having to spend disproportionate amounts of money on defense, whole load of other things, sanctions, you name it. And number three, they had to do it without the privilege of imperialism, without subjecting vast territories. If you just look at what was derived merely from British India to the United Kingdom during the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, some writers point out that the pace of industrial development without those surpluses from British India would have been so low as to not prompt the term revolution to be attached to the industrial transformation that was taking place. That is to say, it was just not fast-paced. It would not have been fast-paced enough. There are other things I wanted to say.
That's time.
We will have an opportunity to extend perhaps some of your statements towards the end. So let me now ask Anne to continue perhaps her initial presentation now.
Yeah, just refresh me with the frame. What's the question again?
The question is, what are the merits that you think apply to the system that you described so eloquently?
Yeah, I think the first thing is intergenerational equity. This is a beautiful place. It is such an amazing cultural diversity, biodiversity, and I want to be able to ensure that young people now and young people in the future can come here, can experience the land, can feel the land, can engage with Indigenous people and the wisdom that we hold. So my focus of this is that when I look at capitalism and attach it to colonialism, I see that it's all about pain and suffering, about divide and conquer, about manipulation, about conquest, about servicing the predatory elite. And what I'm saying is that how do we decolonize our thinking that we live in a world where we do need a little bit of money in terms of capitalism, but our world and our lives can be so much more richer in terms of the gifting that we're talking about, the ability to share, to laugh, to walk the land, to feel the land, to recognize that nature is very much a part of us and that we are part of it. So is the question of, do we work to live or do we live to work? And what is the meaning of this? How do we redefine labor that it's not just work, work, work? That what I see in the world that I've inherited is that we seem to be spending so much time in these systems trying to sustain the system for production and growth, 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 when the question really is, what do we want to achieve in terms of humanity? And can we ensure that we have a climate chance with Mother Earth and all of these other systems that we take for granted and we continue to abuse? So for me, it's looking at the world and thinking, why are we working? Why are we creating wealth? What is the purpose of that? What is the intention? And for me, it's all about story. And so we're dealing with a very complex scenario here, and we need collective wisdom. And the point I'm making is that as Indigenous people, this ancient wisdom is so relevant for modernity, and how do we value it and respect it and bring it into our systems thinking? So from that perspective, I think it's looking at where we come from, where we're going to, and what is the purpose of wealth creation. So as I said, we're living in a capitalist system. We need that so that we can have that exchange. But what is the journey of life? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to reach your full potential as a human being and inherit a world that is about the collective, about the greater good of we and not individualism, me? So I think one of the things that's happening, particularly in my country with climate change, is the fact that the government is really reliant on the human social capital of the fabric of these places that are being destroyed. They're saying that communities need to unite, communities need to cooperate, communities need to get organised. And so one of the things is to look at what have we got at a place-based level of where we live to ensure all of us can reach our full potential as a human being and celebrate life and whole life and see all of the things that are around us that make us human. So from that perspective, I'm looking at this and saying, well, for me, we're dealing with complexity. Climate change is real. It is impacting on each and every one of us. And so how do we come together to ensure that young people born now and into the future will have an opportunity for intergenerational equity to be able to experience these feelings of walking the land, hearing the land, seeing ourselves as not as isolate, but within a holistic system, because as Indigenous people, we come from a holistic society, not a dichotomous society that cuts everything up into different elements and then tries to work how we're going to bring that systems thinking together. So my plea is really to reach out and look at this from a collective wisdom perspective. We are dealing with a crisis of nature, what we as humans have created because of greed and
1 minute.
destruction. And so what I'm saying is that it's time to listen to the voices of Indigenous wisdom, to bring that into our systems thinking and see how we can all, each and every one of us, reach our full potential. It cannot be work to live and live to work. It needs to be business a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And now perhaps, Genevieve, you can continue, given that you were interrupted as you felt. So please carry on. Can you hear me, Genevieve?
I can, yes. I'm not
Yes.
going to do that because I'm now, we're now in this other
Right.
section, but maybe some later I could go back to it if possible. So I believe that an economy that recognizes and respects gifting, as do many pre-market economies, that as human societies have to care for their costly and cute vulnerable infants, avoids the parasitism of capitalist market upon the gifts of all. It maintains an orientation towards the other and attention to needs that fosters community solidarity and respect for the environment, just like Anne was saying. In fact, we have been infected by the market and by the market thinking. We think of indigenous economies as primitive, pre-market, but perhaps they are just not infected by market exchange or by what Alfred Sohn-Rethel called the exchange abstraction. That is an abstraction on the reality plane that causes an abstraction in thought. This abstraction is useful in founding scientific ideas. However, we are now witnesses to the kinds of situations science can bring about if it is detached from gifting. And the opposite of abstract may not be concrete thinking, but integrated gift-based thinking. It is possible then that indigenous societies, which are just as old as our so-called developed own, are not infected by commodity exchange and do not have the superstructural, ego-oriented, death-dealing, war-like abstract values that are bringing about the capitalist Armageddon. I would love to go forward to talk more about the logic of the unilateral gift and how it contrasts with the logic of exchange. But I won't do that right now, but I just want to say that I think maybe if we could return to a gift economy, we could still use the innovations that capitalism has provided. We just don't need to innovate that much anymore. And now we're going on to innovating tremendous weapons, worse and worse. And the AI is going to drive us all out of our minds. Anyway, that's how I have to say.
All right, so that concludes the 2 rounds. And now I'm going to put in my 2 cents, and honestly, it won't be much more than that. So here I go. I would have preferred this extempore, but under the circumstances of not having slept very well, I'm going to read from a little script here. For some time now, I've been developing a critique of Eurocentrism, especially that part of it that I term Euromodernism, which I'll abbreviate as EM for short. That is the specific form of modernity imposed on the world by Europe, thereby precluding any and all other pathways to modernization. We're all made aware of its merits, but rarely dwell much on its costs. My own critique is basic and realist. and it undermines much of the modernist paradigm across the spectrum. Stated simply, just as we need an accurate physics to understand nature, for example, biology, chemistry, etc., we need a realist anthropology to understand society, i.e., economics, politics, philosophy, etc. The classic canonicals, Smith, Hobbes, Auguste Comte, etc., who founded modernist social theory, ill-equipped in this area, made wild and warped assumptions about it, thereby promoting some vacuous notions in their stead. Standard economics theorizing from Smith to our own times is a stellar example, especially its assumptions about human nature, and gets everything wrong for being ignorant of the basics of who we are as anthropic beings, just as much as Hobbes in political theory. In fact, I often describe EM economics as the crown jewel of the hegemonic ideology of modernism, whence its gratuitous Nobel Memorial Award, aside from being a self-referential language game with zero representation of efficacy. Its presumptions, I believe, are no less than a stark libel upon the human race. Art is long, they say, and time is fleeting, so I'll summarize in desperate brevity. The greatest sacrilege of Euro-modernism was to turn our species, a band of convivials, permanently into a company of strangers. That, to me, is human devolution in a nutshell. A human society, that is the original anthropic society, is built on the stadial supports of family, kinship, and community. All simple societies, our original archetypes, exhibit this essential character. When stripped of these healing bondings, we turn into ruthless zombies, flirting with insanity, anomie, and angst. The greatest danger to the human wheel, outside of nature's vagaries, has always stemmed from the ubiquity of male violence. It was the genius of simple tribal society to attempt to enchain that threat, howsoever insecurely, within the healing bonds of emotive affections. No other mechanism has ever even come close to that amicable near resolution, howsoever transiently. It still remains perhaps the only way. So who are we as a species? And that is the first question we need to ask before we can do any social science of any kind. We are mammals, instinctual beings sharing 99% of our genes with chimps and bonobos. Curiously, or maybe not curiously, males, upon careful observation, appear to exhibit a good many chimpian traits, and women many bonobial behaviors. Both are instinctually given. Women and children form the first enduring social units, and women are also the first peacemakers, as they have to create a cordon sanitaire to protect vulnerable infants from both man and beast. The domestication of nature and human males is therefore a civilization desideratum. Women, so to speak, tame men by corralling them within the bonds of domestic felicity, that is, through that four-letter word that we so very carefully shun in economics, L-O-V-E. Simple societies, most but not all, devolve into empires, owing to male adventurism, very close kin to that old Keynesian trope of quote-unquote animal spirits that randomly breaks free of kinship restraints. When that occurs, the original feminine, and this phrase is important, social economy of affections, caves, gives in to the more familiar masculinist political economy of interests within which we constitute class societies. That, by the way, is the tale of the real fall of quote-unquote man, as opposed to biblical fantasies. Contrary to modernist shibboleths, we cannot just announce ourselves with suitable declarations and manifestos into a species other than who we are, any more than we can renounce our instinctual traits. The notion of a step-ladder amelioration towards the promised land is simply a modernist myth. And of course, we, Homo sapiens sapiens, are consummate myth-making animals. The ambitious social engineering agenda of modernism, be it socialist or capitalist, will always fail, if and at spectacular human cost. Modernism fails for not knowing the baseline facts of human anthropology, willfully or not, that we are cooperative convivials who thrive only in small-scale, face-to-face, Gemeinschaft communities. In the typically large-scale, impersonal Gesellschaft nature of modernist nation-states makes that wholly inimical to human welfare. Erstwhile socialism failed, in part, for not grasping this, even though Marx got his famous idol from simple tribal formations that I've just noted, and which he understood sympathetically as primitive communism. When socialism became yet another engineered domain organized from above formation, we entered the dark Michelsian world. I'm referring to Robert Michels, Italian German sociologist, world of an implacable iron law of oligarchy, resulting usually in despotism, whether benign or otherwise. At another remove, socialism's guiding premise of quote unquote international class solidarity, despite its allure, withered away all too quickly. We live, let us remind ourselves, in a spontaneous, self-organizing universe. Nature and society are both spontaneously self-organizing. Anthropic societies may not be engineered. They arise spontaneously on the basis, again, of family, kindred, and community. All life on the planet is instinctually driven, and the inanimate universe is similarly governed by innate laws. That is but the existential alpha and omega of the universe. Now one can grasp the striking delusions of modernist political and social thought. Modernism did apply physics to nature, and yes, physics envy was also part of modernist social theorizing, though based on classical physics, which must be updated now through the quantum revolution. But it was completely clueless in the area of societal speculation. So much of modernist social theory is quite simply and often transparently bunk. But it is not too late. We can still doff standard modernist modes of thinking, being, and doing, and return to who we really are, mutually caring convivials. We could look to the human family for keen instruction. It's a great model, actually, to learn from. It adheres en general not to one single modernist ideal. It is neither democratic, nor equalist, nor individualist, nor free. Yet it gives to each of us a sanctuary that no modernist utopia, capitalist or socialist, could ever hope to provide. The bear has its cave, the fox its lair, the bird its nest, and we are home, built on familial, whether it's real or ersatz, grounds. Note also that this institution is natural and social simultaneously. Besides, anthropic life may not be about living up to artificially and arbitrarily generated ideals, which is the disastrous modernist way, but rather perhaps to abide in near conformity with our received, preferred human traits. That is, if we are to be even marginally contented. We are primarily affective beings, not canny, rational calculators driven by self-seeking, avarice unbound. Our highest human need, surely we can note this, may simply be to huddle. Modernism, metaphorically speaking, tries to turn us heat-seeking mammals into cold-blooded, conniving reptiles. The most noxious toxin within modernist theory is its asocial individualism, which pits each against all permanently, thereby turning adversarialism itself into a vicious universal throughout modernist societies. No wonder that hell is simply other people. That is Jean-Paul Sartre. It's also the signal reason why neither left nor right are ever able to build solidarity over time. Why? Turbocharged egos tear all solidarities down sooner or later. It's also the one key trait that non-European but yet solidly modernist cultures like Japan have never been able to embrace. Even modernist societies of a semi-tribalist nature have not been able to fully accept it, which is why latter-day Scandinavian societies, which are tribalist, appear somewhat more, slightly more sane and hospitable. But there are other notable structural deviants as well from the modernist grid. Three primary examples: women, workers, and native peoples. Why? Women, nurturing children is difficult if you're an individualist in self-love. Workers find safety in numbers of mutual solidarity, and native peoples are inherently communally based, albeit for different reasons, and therefore asocial individualism simply does not fit their mold. We are, as pack and herd animals, that's what the family and tribe is, are attuned to communal living and thrive in it. Deprived of it, we atrophy. No wonder in abject admission of being a failed society, Britain, a lead EM nation, appointed a minister, believe it or not, of loneliness. Fancy that. Need I say more? Nowhere was EM voted in by popular acclaim or majority vote. It was always forced upon recalcitrant peoples. We've been forced to live a lie under stern modernist auspices in defiance of our own deeply felt needs, which is why so many of us are, on the inside, far better, if occasionally worse, than what the system requires of us. Do you know any EM constitution that guarantees our really fundamental needs? No, I'm not talking about food, clothing, shelter, security. Yes, but also mutual solidarity, caring, warmth, hospitality, and love. Point that to me. No, so we can return to our anthropic roots epistemically and empirically. We could then be rid of false values, false expectations, false attitudes, false motivations, and false goals that have us live drab, insecure, enervating, unfulfilled, cheerless, and unrequiting lives tied to the wheel of ever increasingly endless labors. To sum up now, these are the derivations. That was only meta theory that provides the basis for what I want to say. First, economics is not a science, but rather a policy instruction manual for modernist agendas, and the economy is not an irreducible data. Instead, our material preoccupations are embedded inextricably in context of cultural norms and biological needs. Acquisitive ambitions appear not as innate properties, but are perforce imposed, inculcated drives. And human contentment bears a very, very low correlation with GDP. So yes, if there were a sort of an ideal economy in society, it would probably be closer to a natural economy constituted by our primal structures of human association, which is family, kindred, and community, and we should perhaps not stray too far from their norms, which is to say, to conclude, that modernist modalities of economy and society, which is all that we've been discussing, whether it's capitalism or socialism, that we're immured in, that are willfully destroyed, those very structures will keep us ever in a perpetual state of alienation, loneliness, desolation, restlessness, and despair, if we persist, as we appear to be doing, on that modernist path. So that's the best I can do for now. So I will leave you with that. So that concludes at least, the two questions and the answers. Now it is open for people to talk to each other. I think Genevieve did have some other things to say, which she didn't have time for, so I'll invite her to continue there. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you muted, Genevieve? I'm not.
Now I am. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead. You can add since there were things you wanted to say, so complete your
Well,
story.
I didn't finish my description of the gift economy and its logic. And it does have a logic, and I'm going to just briefly read you about that. But I'm not reading it, I'm not telling you the whole picture, just a part. So let me just briefly sketch a few elements of what I see as the interpersonal logic of the unilateral gift and how it is contradicted by quid pro quo exchange. When one person gives to another, she has to attend to the other's possible needs, mind read them, as the child psychologists say, not from any psychic ability, but from understanding the circumstances of the child. A simple example would be thinking that if a child has not eaten for several hours, she is probably hungry, so feeding her. When someone, A, gives unilaterally to B, satisfying B's need, she gives or attributes value to B. The implication being that if B had not been important for her, she would not have taken the initiative to give something appropriate to satisfy the need. The child receives the repeated satisfaction of her needs and the attribution of intrinsic value to her by implication with gratification and self-esteem. For want of a better word, I call this value received by the child gift value or gifted value. Much of the same can be said for adults who receive unilateral gifts. Because of the division of labor, mostly excluding males from care of young children, this experience was not included in the work of male philosophers and economists until recently, and motherers themselves were not usually philosophers or economists. Now things have changed, and we can hazard an integration of that experience, even with such important work as that of Karl Marx. If we add unilateral gifting to Marx's discussion of the equation of value in commodity exchange, we can see how this gift value is contradicted, suspended, and depersonalized, because in fact, the product in exchange is not gifted to anyone. In fact, its transitivity towards a particular other is blocked by the process of exchange and the anonymity of the market. Rather, when a product is for sale as a commodity, it is split on the one hand into its specific but impersonal use value for anyone, and on the other hand, into value in exchange in relation to all the other products of that kind on the market. Its assessment in the general equivalent money makes its exchange value specific in relation to the other products. And when it is bought, it can be consumed by the buyer, placed in a new production process, or given again as a gift, attributing gift value to the receiver. This latter process makes unilateral giving dependent on exchange, that is, on a bilateral process, and confuses the picture so that it seems like that little or no unilateral gifting has been taking place beyond the market, and that the logic of exchange is the fundamental human logic. Looking at gifting as the original process and exchange as its contradiction changes the primacy and inevitability of exchange and lets us see how it can function as a parasitic structure. If the product that is purchased is used in a new production process, the surplus value produced by the worker in that process is gifted to the capitalist and given, that is, added by the capitalist in a money form to his or her capital, giving it gift value or gifted value, the gifted value to the capital itself, increasing it to be used for further investment or further production processes to grow endlessly. Or it can be used to buy symbolic consumer items that give the capitalist him or herself gifted value, showing perhaps how much by his own prowess or hers she or he has elicited value which has been given to him by maternal lady luck, increasing his or her self-esteem. I think of Trump and Elon Musk, and I believe that this is a motivation for greed coming from the uninvestigated realm of the interaction between gifting and exchange. That's what I have to say.
Oh, is that it? Okay. I've just received notification that Jeff Sachs is going to join us. So, Diane, perhaps you can help him sign on.
Sure, I'll message him.
Right, and he's trying to do that. So in between, as we wait for Jeff, who's going to, by the way, I've asked him, my question to him was, is there only one way of doing an economic system, or are there multiple ways, and not necessarily bound by what history has given us, but even going forwards? And I thought I'll have him to address that, and any one of you also can speak as we wait for him. So Steve, what do you think? Are we stuck with our historical examples that we have? Do we continue on forever in those tracks, even though they've all been disastrous?
No,
and
I
so many-
think we're, as I've said, I think we're in for a catastrophic breakdown of human civilization. And that's been caused by two things: vested interests in promoting fossil fuel growth, but the people who enabled that fossil fuel explosion were mainstream economists who trivialized the dangers we face, in particular William Nordhaus, but all the morons, pardon the French, but that's what I think they are, who've joined him in completely trivializing the dangers of climate change. So all the discussion we're making about what would be a preferred social system, I think we're going to be in a survival mode as the production system we have breaks down. And in that case, the only wisdom that's going to give us a chance to survive in the future is going to be the indigenous wisdom that Anne spoke about earlier. I'll leave the floor for Jeff. Pardon.
Okay, just before Jeffrey, hello, Jeff. I'm glad
Greetings,
you're able to
everybody.
join. Yes, just before you join, let me ask Radhika also the same question. Are we stuck with capitalism and socialism, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, or are we able, do you think, to conceive of systems beyond that? What's your feeling?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that capitalism and socialism are Tweedledum and Tweedledee at all. In fact,
that's why I asked you that question. Yes.
And I was going to say that, you know, when you use the term European modernity, people who use the term modernity are typically, in a general social sense rather than a specifically cultural sense, are usually trying to avoid using the term capitalism. And I think I think we have to name the beast. We have to call it what it is. And we have to understand how it operates. And we have to understand how socialism is different. Socialism has, as I've said in my earlier presentation, all the existing socialisms have had to be built against enormous odds. And I think that their achievements have been very significant. So in that sense, we are not stuck at all. I think we need to move forward from capitalism now, not because of, while I agree with what Steve said when he was talking about, you know, when capitalism was on better behavior. But that was a time past, and I really don't think it's possible today to dial the clock back to that stage. I think we are stuck with either this system of highly financialized, inequality generating, productively failing capitalism, or we have to move towards some form of more equal, better planned society that gives more freedom as well as more equality to individuals, to all individuals. Freedom for some is not freedom. Freedom has to be for all. So that's that. I mean, for the rest, I agree with you, Rajani, when you talk about our continuity with the animal world. But I really do wonder about your extreme polarization of feminine and masculine principles, and this idea that only, the feminine principle generates human society. No, I think both of them generate human society. They are equally responsible. And I think that they were organized rather differently from what we see today, but that's another whole thing altogether. But that's my answer to your question for now.
Okay, thank you. And again, I will make no effort to defend what I said. I spent far too much time talking about it. And right now, I'll just accept comments. But I'd like to invite Jeff now. I asked the same question, Jeff, of Steve and Radhika. Are we stuck with the received models of capitalism and socialism, or are we able to conceive of a future where perhaps there'll be innovations in that area and you get a very different system? Then, I don't feel we are doomed by history at all, especially what a terrible history it's been, whether it's capitalism or socialism, or in terms of its terrible, terrible things that have happened in its name. So what do you think, Jeff?
First, let me say hello to everybody. I'm in the middle of a conference in Budapest, so I'm sneaking out, but happily so, to be with all of you. I would say 2 points as a starting point. First, there is a diversity of the political economic institutions around the world. There isn't a uniformity. And we should appreciate that diversity. I was in China just 3 days ago. I'm extremely impressed by what China has accomplished over the last 45 years. And that is clearly not a system that can be pigeonholed or even easily described. It is a quite complex system of public and private institutions. The governance structures are very sophisticated, multi-level. This is a 1.4 billion person economy, which will not impress Radhika, but impresses the rest of us. But it's almost as big as India, even. Let me put it that way. But in any event, it's a completely distinctive economic system. When the party calls it socialism with Chinese characteristics or whatever it is, I would put an emphasis on the Chinese characteristics. Actually, it's quite a diverse and sophisticated society that I learn a lot from. Now, just to say that, I think it's also true in Europe, though it's changing. But I've always noted and do believe that what the Scandinavian countries achieved in the 20th century was extremely notable. I was and remain in some sense a social democrat, and I know how different it is from the US system, the US ethics, the US milieu. Of course, it is true also, it has to be said that the Nordics are being step by step recreated in the US image to their great detriment. But even till today, they have much longer life expectancy, much less poverty, much less inequality, and so forth. And this is a tribute to a system that was born of social strife 125 years ago, and they created something quite special. And I have to tell you, when I first went to Sweden in 1976 as a student, and I came back very excited, and I asked my advisor, who was Martin Feldstein, very conservative professor at Harvard, I said, Marty, I'd like to write my dissertation on the Swedish economy. And he said, oh, that's not interesting. Go study international finance. So this was the American mentality. And this is a very different system. So that's the first point that I would say is there already is a quite rich diversity that we should appreciate. The second point is that our challenges really are different in our world today from 50 or 100 years ago. I am a materialist in the sense that I do think changing technology drives a lot of societal pressures and changes. That's one part. And the Anthropocene is something absolutely real and absolutely bringing us to an extraordinary crisis that I caught Steve talking about just as I was getting on. The most recent paper that I have read on this was from my colleague, James Hansen, who I regard as my climate guru. And it's a preprint, but it's a dramatic paper. He has told me for 25 years, the crisis is worse than we think, it's happening faster than we think, and the IPCC, by being a consensus institution, is 10 years behind reality. And this is a dramatic paper that he's producing just now, showing many horrifying things, by the way, but one of them is the real possibility of the ocean circulation system not only slowing, but stopping. And that if it does, which I hadn't realized, it does many things, but one is that it dramatically warms the Southern Ocean, so it accelerates the disintegration of the ice sheets, and it dramatically cools Europe, so it pushes Europe into an extreme crisis, both as the dipole of this. And he is giving a very, very detailed argument about why we're closer to the shutdown of the thermohaline circulation than we have thought, and why the IPCC is way behind. So in a world in which the environmental crises are going to get worse, sad to say, they're going to be very dramatic, they're going to dominate our lives and politics, and it doesn't matter what the Trumps of, I mean, it matters, but it doesn't, the Trumps of the world don't stop any of that. Of course, they accelerate it, but the point is we will be in a different mental milieu in 5 or 10 years Already we have Los Angeles burning down. We have Category 5 hurricanes hitting the U.S. Our dunderhead corrupt politicians refuse to draw the links, but the links are completely obvious to anybody watching this. So my own approach on this has been to say it's not capitalism or socialism. It is, I use the term because I work at the UN, it is sustainable development, which I define as simultaneously addressing economic, social, environmental, and geopolitical peace issues. And so redefining an economic system that can provide the public goods and the private goods to address economic, social, environmental, and peace building criteria. The institutions you need for that are completely different from the ones that we have. Of course, there's room for market forces, there's room for state planning. I put a great deal of stress on the need for 25-year plans, not 5-year plans, because we're in an age where we're building fundamental infrastructure for the future in a quite different way. I think we need a different global institutional structure. I work for the UN for $1 a year for the last 25 years. And the UN, obviously, to me, is a good idea, but it doesn't work. It doesn't have resources, doesn't have funding, doesn't have enforcement mechanisms, but we need it. So I'm not cynical, I'm just desperate, which is different. And so I think we will move. I think we need to keep our eye on what are the actual problems that need solving. The problems that most need solving today, in my view, are continued poverty in the midst of plenty, adjusting to the AI revolution, creating institutions of social justice, addressing the multiple interconnected environmental crises, which themselves require very deep technological changes, as well as changes of behavior and social organization, and changing the geopolitics so that we actually do this at a global scale, not just at a haphazard national scale. To my mind, that would lead to quite different political institutions, economic ethos, functioning of multilateralism, functioning of regionalism, because I think regions become much more important in the kind of world that we're living in. Countries need to get along with their neighbors because they share rivers, forests, renewable energy resources, intermittent energy, and so forth in a geographic span. So regional cooperation, to my mind, is much more important. So I think we're necessarily in the business of inventing new institutions that meet the new challenges. And this is how we should view it. I try increasingly to drop all labels of capitalism, socialism, because they're so vague, they're so weaponized. All you have to do in the United States is say, Communist Party of China. That's all you have to say. And you have an enemy that is worthy of war. There's no sense, well, that's the historic name of this party. It has nothing to do with what they think it has to do with. It's not about world domination. It's about trying to solve problems of a complex society of 1.4 billion people. But the words are weapons. And I used to use the words capitalism, of course, or used to use these words, but I tend not to use them anymore because I want to talk about solutions and what kinds of institutional solutions or ethical solutions or pragmatic approaches we need to actually address the very dire and growing crises that are cascading on us, as well as the fact that we have better opportunities to eliminate poverty, to educate children, to do other things than we've ever had before. So I don't want to just dwell on the negatives. We also have the potential for massive breakthroughs, in my view. So this is how I would view it.
Right.
But I think we're in an invention mode that is extremely important. And I think with Rajani, your sustained and I think very correct critique of 500 years of European dominance, that's over anyway. In a way, we're in a completely different cultural and geopolitical milieu. You can spend a lot of time in China, not hear anything about the United States other than kind of scratching the head, what's the matter with you people? But not any kind of compelling urgency. Just you come from a strange country mainly, and I think that this is increasingly the case around the world. That the U.S. and Europe, it's 10% of the world population. It's 800 million people. It's not the compelling side. We've got a Circus Barker right now as president. He's going to make threats. He's going to vent. He thinks that closing the U.S. market to the exports of other countries is going to terrify them, but it doesn't anymore because no one's dependent on the U.S. the same way that might have been true 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. So in this sense, I do think that we have the opportunity, if we don't blow ourselves up, actually to solve a lot of interesting problems.
Let me ask a second question as a follow-up, Jeff. You've talked about development and growth and so on. I thought that endless growth was the ideology of the cancer cell. Why must we grow endlessly? What's the point of it?
I don't believe that we're talking about endless growth. And I'd like to use not the word growth, I like to use the word progress or improvement of well-being. We are not in any sense at a thermodynamic limit. So what is absolutely true, on a finite planet, you could not have, permanent exponential growth. That Malthus said it, and we could all say it in different ways. But I don't believe we are really at the kind of thermodynamic limits. I think we're at the limits of ingenuity, kindness, strategy, and so on. If you take the computer that I'm talking to you on, the components of it are, I think, something like $5. It's mostly sand. It's got a few other trace metals. The computer is not the thermodynamic limit. The fact is, some geniuses over the last 100 years figured out how to actually get something out of those $5 of raw materials in a way that was completely unimaginable 100 years ago. So I'm a believer in the digital revolution, for example. I think it's not a small thing, and I think it could be a very positive thing. And by the way, every 10 minutes, I'm asking Perplexity a question on my phone and getting wonderful answers because it can search 10,000 journals, all the newspapers and everything else, and give me what I'm looking for instantaneously. To my mind, that's a real improvement. So I don't believe that we're at the limit of improvement, at the limit of improving people's lives, at the limit of material security. I don't believe the degrowth rhetoric. Of course, we can't go on using fossil fuels the way we do. Of course, we can't just compound the technologies as we have them right now. But I am impressed by the fact that the incoming solar radiation is roughly 5,000 times our power use in the world. So we've got a long way to go before we reach thermodynamic limits. What is true is just raw, sheer growth. What we call, GDP measured growth is a horrible indicator of anything right now. And I did have and I'll just stop here. I had the great pleasure to, as a student, to know or be taken a little bit under the wing of Simon Kuznets, who used to invite me over to his house once a month when he was an emeritus professor in his 80s and I was a young student at Harvard. And he was a wonderful gentleman, wonderful. And he said to me, Jeff, remember, GDP is not a measure of well-being. It was never meant to be a measure of well-being. It was meant, as he explained to me, to measure the size of an economy for war planning. That was the original purpose of national income accounting, that in World War I, they did not know how big the US economy was and what its productive capacity was. So the assignment starting in 1919 was measure the economy so we can plan for war, basically. Then came along Keynes 20 years afterwards, and the message was plan for stabilization. But it was never meant as a measure of welfare. And so that we have to put aside. And since growth is so intrinsically tied to national income accounts, we should understand that growth is not the objective by any circumstance, but improvement is. So I'm still Francis Baconian enough to believe that human ingenuity can improve the human lot.
But let me pose the same question to the others who haven't spoken yet. How about Anne? What do you think?
I'm gonna have to run in
I realize that.
three minutes because the governor of the Central Bank of Hungary is waiting for me. So, but I
Right,
want to
thank you.
listen to the next answer and then I'm going to duck out.
Okay, Anne, why don't you tell us whether growth has any meaning at all in the system that you described?
It depends on what you're growing, a human being or production. So yeah, it just depends on that. And you know, like all of the things I've learned is how do we invest in growing decent human beings? So that's my focus. Thank you.
Okay, how about Genevieve? Does the gift economy have to grow like capitalism or any of these other systems?
Yeah, the gift economy has to become the basic logic of society. That's how it has to grow. And that will diminish a lot of the bad aspects of the society we're in.
So you subscribe to the notion of growth as a necessary thing. Is that it?
No, well, yeah, yes. Okay. Yeah.
How about Steve?
Very quickly, Jeff, I recommend you take a look at a post I've linked in the chat to do the math, the Do the Math blog by another physicist you might not know of, Tom Murphy. He points out that if we continue growing at 2.3% per annum, the thermodynamic load of that will mean in 400 years, we raise the temperature of the planet to the boiling point of water. So what we're approaching is the limits to the biosphere being able to support the life we have. And that's where I think that's one reason I think we have to get off planet. Makes me favorable to what Elon Musk is doing, even though I've got criticism in other fields, obviously. We have to manage to get our technology off the planet. But I think the trouble is, courtesy of economists, we've accelerated far too rapidly with still fossil fuel-based energy. And that's, if you look at a paper of mine called The Appallingly Bad Neoclassical Economics of Climate Change, you'll see just how ridiculous the work is that supported us ignoring the limits to growth for the last 50 years. That's the crisis I think we face. I hope we get through it, but I see us going through a crisis before we can approach the type of technological future that you and I both hope is feasible for our species.
You know, it was in 1960, they were discussing growth as an issue. 1960, the Club of Rome.
Yeah.
So how is it that we lost track of that whole discussion? Radhika, any ideas?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, first of all, I mean, there are a number of points that I think need to be made, but let me just immediately respond to what Steve is saying. I mean, while of course I agree with you that the on your main point, but if you look at any index of the climate emergency more generally, whether it's climate change or pollution or loss of biodiversity or what have you, practically every one of them is rising, but relatively gently. But then after about 1980, it becomes steeper. That is, the more neoliberal our economy has become, the more unequal it has become, the more we have cost the world. the more we have cost the planet, that is to say, in every dimension. The second thing I want to say is that while I do not at all disagree with the sentiment that lies behind degrowth, I really agree with Sachs that growth is not really the way to talk about it. You can have growth when somebody writes a novel or gives a performance of their poems. That's not doesn't have the same resource intensity as producing more weapons or whatever. So there are different types of growth. And as Anne said, what are you trying to grow? That's really matters. So different types of production systems have different resource footprints, higher or lower. So that's very important. And I would say that, there was a question in the comment, what should we do? How do we start living differently in our communities? And I would say that demanding higher levels of public and common and universal services, which is and publicly produced ones, which is directly against the tendency of contemporary capitalism to essentially privatize what should be public services, would be a very, very good start. And I think that's why I defend the term imperial socialism, because while Sachs is absolutely right that there's a diversity of capitalist systems. Swedish capitalism is not the same as American capitalism, is not the same as Australian capitalism, etc. We have different types of capitalism and we have different types of socialisms. Chinese and Russian are two very different types of socialism. But I do think Chinese socialism is meaningful. It is meaningfully socialist, I mean. So the important difference to me is who controls whom. Does capital control the state or does the state control capital? In China, the state controls capital. That is why I call it meaningfully socialist. And I think that retaining that distinction is very important, because right now we have like a government in power in the United States, which is essentially the dream government of the most maverick types of capitalists that it's possible to have. And the others are coming around too. They're all, Zuckerberg was on the other side now. He's siding with Donald Trump. So really it is a utopia of the capitalist class. And the big problem the world faces right now is that there is a very militarily powerful state that is controlled by the worst kind of capitalists in the world. And I think that is the real issue. And that is why the terms capitalism and socialism remain relevant. But having said that, I am part of an organization, convener of an organization, the International Manifesto Group, whose manifesto, which we published in 2021, is entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. That is to say, it's not just multipolarity, like there are many poles of economic power in the world, but it is a pluripolarity in the sense that every one of these poles is different. So the multitude of poles is already helpful because it shows the dispersal of productive power around the world and therefore the weakening of imperialist impulses, without which capitalism cannot survive. And the plurality part shows that, yes, indeed, it's going to be a long time before we live in anything like a sort of uniform socialism, if we ever do. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily desirable. But the key is to control the power of capital. If your country can do that, you're already winning. It doesn't, then what path you take onward from that, keeping capital in control and then looking to improve the lives of the people, I don't mind. It's your democratic decision. It's every country's democratic decision. And I think the very good ideas that we have heard today are all very helpful in achieving something like that.
Maybe we could go into a phase now of final comments on everything, perhaps. I was just going to say, I think if I remember right, Vietnam calls itself a socialist market economy. I think that is their term. And perhaps that is going to be a sort of, not a model, but certainly a sort of inspiration in societies that want to follow that path. China probably also approximates that, regardless of what the ideological implications are. Any comments, Steve? Final comments on what we have tried to do here?
Well, I just actually talking about, Jeff was quite right to talk about different types of capitalism, and the American, I think, is the most dysfunctional of the lot. And it's dysfunctional because it denies a role for the state. At the other extreme, you have the Chinese system, which used to, was old-fashioned socialist under Mao in many ways. And I know quite a bit about the debates between the pro-grain and pro-legume factions of the Communist Party at the time, for example. But post Deng Xiaoping, it's been socialism. It's been a capitalist system with a full acknowledgement of the role of the state. And also, in some ways, it functions as a form of not the democracy that we think is democracy, where we get a choice between different people suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, but actually a form of way in which, a bit like the genuine Athenian system of democracy, which was sortition. You basically chose people who were intelligent members to guide the future planning of society, and that's indeed what the Communist Party has been doing. So in that sense, even though it's got its authoritarian sides as well, it's more capable of planning for the future. And that's one reason why life for ordinary Chinese people 40 years ago has been dramatically transformed in the last 40 years, whereas the working class in the West, and particularly in America, has, if anything, seen its situation stagnate or go backwards. So there is a lot to be said for different forms of organisation of society. But overall, my main fear is that we're going to see that breakdown because of climate change in our lifetimes, and I'm including myself, and I'm turning 72 in 2 months. I think it's a toss-up whether I'll die of old age or climate change. At the moment, I'm backing climate change. So that's the severity of the world we face, and we have to be ready for quite bizarre changes in the nature of society in the future. It won't be anything like what we prefer. It's what we have to do to survive.
Genevieve, would you like to have some concluding comments now on your gift economy idea, or the unilateral gifting and everything else?
Well, it would be great if we could gift to the people of the future with a healthy planet, which is what we're not doing at all. We're refusing that gift. And so, yeah, that's all I could wish for. We have a huge responsibility, and I don't think we're adequate to the job.
I see. Is Anne still around, or has she left us? Anne, would you like some concluding comments on both on anything really before we wind down here?
And we can't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you. I guess the challenge for me is really thinking about how do we collectively achieve some sort of economic democracy where we have shared wealth creation and that we can think about all of these things. But for me, I agree, we live in a pluriverse, not a universe. And so we need this diversity. And that's what I'm saying is that we are going into, particularly in terms of climate change, I call it climate chaos, because there's so much uncertainty. So how do we all see ourselves as belonging to a pluriverse where it's about the we and not the me, about eco, not about ego, about individualism versus, as I said earlier, communityism. So all of these things is what I'm saying is that there is a challenge, but there's also an opportunity and a gift of wisdom from Indigenous people in terms of how do we come in and think about the systems thinking to ensure that public interest matters and the greater good of all of us are considered in the bioregional planning concepts that we have had from the beginning of time to always manage on scale, always be inclusive. So it's been a great conversation. And as I said, I've learned quite a lot from all of you, and I'm not an economist, but I do dream that we can create a coalition of hope, and that our job is to give it a good go and try and achieve that collectively.
If I may say so, I think perhaps a world without economists would be a far better place than it is right now. But I think we should also acknowledge Diane has been behind the scenes throughout this time. So Diane, would you show yourself, please? And there she is. She has seen us all through, as she does every single time. Thank you, Diane, for everything. And I thank you all for, I know we don't stand on the same ground in so many areas, but I hope that this was a useful discussion of things that we don't normally discuss, whether as economists or anything else, because we're so unidisciplinary that we usually either are preaching to the choir or at least operating in a very narrow segment where we more or less are assured of a certain reception but I deliberately put this together so that we have contrasting ways of looking at things. I think, as I've said, I think I wrote that in one of my notes to you all, that truth comes easier through contrast than by analysis. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you all personally, each one of you, for making the time to do this. Be well, be safe, and I hope the world will also be the same way. Thank you all.